The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical drone as Katie Morrison pushed through the ICU's double doors at 5:33 a.m., 23 minutes before her shift officially began. Her badge clattered softly against her sternum as she moved, the sound of small metal hitting worn fabric. The hospital smelled like it always did at this hour, antiseptic overlaid with the ghost of floor wax and something underneath that never quite washed away, something organic and tired. She didn't look remarkable. Mid-40s, dark hair pulled into a regulation bun, scrubs that had been washed enough times to lose their crispness. A slight limp in her left leg, barely noticeable if you weren't watching for it. Most people weren't. Most people never noticed Katie Morrison at all, which was precisely how she had engineered it. The ICU stretched before her in organized rows of beds, each one enclosed in its own glass-fronted room like specimens in a museum. Monitors beat their steady rhythms. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical songs. She moved to the first station and began wiping down the monitors with practiced, methodical efficiency, the kind of efficiency that came from muscle memory, from doing the same precise movements 10,000 times until they became thoughtless as breathing. Her hands were steady. Always. They never shook, not anymore, not since she had trained them not to. One of the other night shift nurses, Carla, watched her from the medication cart. "You're gonna wear the screens out," she said, not unkindly. Katie didn't look up. Dust gets into the electronics. Increases failure rate. She moved to the next monitor, the same careful circular motions. If a monitor fails during a code, we lose vital signs. Costs us seconds we don't have. Carla shook her head. There was something unsettling about the way Katie talked sometimes, like she was speaking from experience most nurses would only read about in textbooks. "You're too careful." Katie paused, her cloth still against the glass. "No such thing," she said quietly, and went back to work. By 6:15 a.m., the night shift had thinned and the day crew was beginning to trickle in. Dr. Richard Sterling arrived at 6:23 a.m. precisely, the kind of man who made a ceremony of punctuality. He wore his white coat like a general's uniform and moved through the ICU like he owned it, which, in a practical sense, he did. ICU director, 15 years, built the department's reputation on cost efficiency and patient outcomes. The hospital board loved him. The nurses avoided him. He paused at the supply closet, where Katie was cross-checking the medication inventory against the computer system. His eyes, pale blue and flat as winter sky, tracked her movements with clinical interest. She didn't acknowledge his presence. He watched as her finger traced down a morphine count line, then moved to the computer screen, then back to the physical log. A frown, barely perceptible, creased the space between her eyebrows. "Problem, Morrison." His voice had the texture of a tank idling in a garage, power at rest, waiting. Katie's head came up smoothly, and her expression reset to its default, attentive, blank, subordinate. "No, sir. Just verifying counts. They balanced last week." "Yes, sir." "They balance now?" "Not quite. Off by 14 milligrams. Probably documentation lag." Her voice remained level, matter-of-fact. "I'll check with pharmacy." Sterling nodded, filed away the moment like he was cataloging data, and moved on. But he had seen something. The sharpness in her eyes. The way she cross-referenced forms like someone trained to spot inconsistencies, like someone who understood the weight of small numbers. Like someone who had been trained to notice what didn't fit. By 6:45 a.m., the unit was fully staffed and humming with pre-dawn activity. Katie moved through her medication pass in room 338, pushing for fluids, checking drainage, charting vitals with the kind of precision that made the system work. This was her domain, the quiet competence of technical care, the invisible architecture that kept critically ill people breathing. She had spent nearly 20 years learning to disappear into this work. The hospital gown swished as she turned, and her pant leg rode up slightly, exposing what she had not meant to expose. For exactly 3 seconds, the worn leather of her left combat boot was visible, size 12 men's, muddy, scuffed, the kind of boot that had seen use in climates that didn't exist in Colorado. A colleague from the day shift, Jenny, glanced over from the adjacent room. "Oh, you wore them again. Those your brothers?" Katie lowered her pant leg with one economical movement. "Yes. They're so beat up. Doesn't he want them back?" Katie's hands continued their work, steady as a surgical laser. "He's not coming home." The lie was delivered with such quiet finality that Jenny didn't push further. "They're useful for the cold tile floors. Better traction." It wasn't entirely false. The boots were useful. They grounded her. They reminded her of who she had been and, more importantly, who she needed everyone to believe she was not. Just Katie Morrison, 43-year-old ICU nurse from Denver, nothing notable, nothing worth remembering. The boots stayed in her locker except during moments like this, when she needed the weight of them against the floor, the small anchor of something real that no one could quite understand. She moved through the rest of her morning rounds with the same invisible competence. Blood sugar checks, wound assessments, ventilator settings. By 7:44 a.m., the ICU had reached its day shift rhythm, and Katie was charting at the station when the first commotion started at the main entrance. A gurney was incoming. Critical. ETA 3 minutes. The intercom crackled, incoming level 1 trauma, cardiac surgery post-op, ETA 2 minutes, prep room 347. Sterling appeared within seconds, reading the incoming report, his jaw tightening infinitesimally. A Navy officer, apparently. Post-op day 2 from cardiac surgery at Fitzsimmons. Being transferred to Sacred Heart for complications monitoring. No, wait, not transferred. The chart note said patient request. The Navy had sent him specifically to Sacred Heart ICU, specifically to Sterling's unit. Katie was preparing room 347 when she heard the sirens approaching. She moved efficiently through the checklist, monitor leads, for lines, ventilator settings, emergency equipment positioned. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that came from having done this hundreds of times. She was so focused on the work that she almost didn't look at the patient's face when they wheeled him in. Almost. The stretcher wheel squeaked on the tile as they brought him through, and Katie's eyes landed on the patient's face, and everything stopped. Not literally. Her hands didn't freeze. Her breathing didn't catch. Her expression didn't change. But something inside her went absolutely still, the way a predator goes still when it realizes it's being watched. Commander Robert Chen. Navy. 52 years old according to the chart. And Katie recognized him not from the photo in the medical record but from a memory 3 years old, of dress blues at her front door, of a man with shoulders like a doorframe handing her a folded flag with words she had barely heard. "Your son was brave," he had said. "The bravest man I've ever had the honor to know." David. Her son. Naval aviator. 3 years ago, North Arabian Sea, classified operation that explained nothing and took her son's left arm from the shoulder down. She had met Robert Chen only once, but you don't forget the face of the man who stands between you and the full weight of loss. You don't forget the way his eyes held something that looked like understanding, like he, too, had lost count of how many flag foldings he had witnessed. And now he was in room 347, sedated, post-op, vulnerable. And Sterling was observing from the doorway with that flat gaze, noting how Katie's fingers paused for exactly one heartbeat before she continued charting. "You know this patient?" Sterling's voice came from directly behind her. Katie's pen continued its motion across the chart without hesitation. "No, sir." "You hesitated." "I didn't, sir." Her voice remained level, professional, empty of anything that could be measured or questioned. "Just reviewing his post-op status." Sterling studied her for a moment longer, and something in his expression shifted, not suspicion exactly, but curiosity. The kind of curiosity that makes a predator pause before deciding whether prey is worth hunting. "Ensure his drips are titrated per protocol," he said finally. "No modifications without my approval." "Of course, sir." He left, and Katie exhaled a breath she hadn't consciously been holding. She looked at Commander Chen's sedated face, at the cardiac monitor tracing his heartbeat in steady green lines, and she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger. Something closer to recognition, the moment when the past stops being past and becomes present again, standing right there in room 347, connected to tubes and monitors and her own carefully constructed anonymity. She returned to her charting. But that wasn't the worst part. The morning round started like most mornings at Sacred Heart, Sterling's voice carrying across the ICU like a tank idling in a garage, surgical residents trailing behind him in their white coats, clipboards clutched like shields. Katie was already at Commander Chen's bedside, checking his chest tube output, her movements precise and economical. The fluid was the right color, the right consistency. Everything was exactly as it should be. Sterling stopped at the foot of the bed. His eyes moved across the monitors, then settled on Katie with the kind of focus that made the air pressure change. "Morrison," he said, loud enough for the family members standing in the corner to hear. "I'm reviewing the admission timeline. The patient arrives at 0600, intubated in the field. RT doesn't receive the intubation order until 06:15. 15 minutes. Did you or did you not delay notifying respiratory therapy because you felt your assessment was superior to protocol?" Katie's jaw tightened slightly. Her hand stayed steady. "The pre-oxygenation took." Rhetorical question, Sterling cut her off, not looking at her. He turned to the residents. "This is what happens when nursing staff make clinical decisions they're not trained to make. Chain of command exists for a reason." He made a notation on his clipboard, turned, and walked to the next bed, his resident scrambling to follow. The family looked uncomfortable. The daughter, Chen's daughter, avoided Katie's eyes. By 07:30, Katie was walking back from the medication dispensary when she saw it. Her name on the unit board in the hallway, the public whiteboard where patient assignments lived, written in red marker under a column that hadn't existed yesterday, failure to follow chain of command. Below it, initial counseling session scheduled Friday 1400. 2 physicians passed the board without slowing. One of them whispered something. The other nodded. Katie kept walking, didn't stop. Her breathing remained even. But the fluorescent lights above seemed brighter, hotter, and she felt the weight of it settling across her shoulders like a ruck that wouldn't come off. Lunch was at 1200. She made a sandwich, turkey, mustard, 1 slice of Swiss, and carried it to the break room. 4 nurses sat at the corner table, mid-conversation. They saw her enter. One of them looked at another. Without words, without drama, they gathered their things. Water bottles. Phone chargers. One nurse left her lunch half-eaten on the plate. They were gone before Katie even reached the refrigerator. She sat alone at the table, unwrapped her sandwich, and didn't eat. The break room was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of an alarm from somewhere down the corridor. She counted the ceiling tiles. 63. Her sandwich dried out in front of her. She stared at it the way a sniper stares at a target, with complete attention and no emotion. 30 minutes later, she was back on the unit. The real blow came at 14:30. Chen's family was visiting, his daughter and son-in-law, who'd driven down from Fort Collins early to check on him. Katie was explaining the chest tube output, the color, the consistency, what they should expect over the next 24 hours. The daughter was asking intelligent questions about drainage amounts and infection signs. Katie was answering them fully, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd explained complex medical concepts to worried families hundreds of times before. Sterling entered the room without knocking. "Mr. Chen's family," he said, his voice smooth and apologetic, "I apologize that our enthusiastic staff sometimes overstep their scope of practice. Nurse Morrison, patient education is a physician's role. You can return to your actual duties." The daughter's face flushed. Her son-in-law looked down at his shoes. Katie took one measured breath. Just one. She felt the heat rise behind her eyes, not fear, not anger, but something colder, something that came from a place deep enough that it didn't have a name. A single tear tracked down her left cheek. she observed it happening, as though it belonged to someone else. She wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with Sterling, her voice steady and clear as glass. "Of course, Doctor. I'll remember my place." Sterling smiled, a real smile, satisfied, and turned to charm the family with explanations they'd already received from Katie, only slower and with more hand gestures. The daughter nodded politely. Chen watched Katie from the bed, his eyes tracking her as she updated his chart in the hallway outside his room. Through the glass window, she could see Sterling glancing at her. His pen was moving. He was making another note. Katie's hand shook as she wrote. Not from fear. From restraint. The trembling wasn't weakness. It was the physical manifestation of holding something back that wanted very badly to emerge. That night, she sat at her kitchen table with a stack of printed medication logs she'd been collecting for 3 days. Her apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the other room and the occasional sound of traffic on the street below. She spread the pages across the table like a puzzle. Pattern. There it was. Clear as a surgical incision. Ghost consultations, billing codes for specialists who'd never actually seen the patients. Equipment orders for patients already discharged. A supply company called Meridian Medical Solutions appearing on invoices every other day with quantities that didn't match the patient census. The numbers were small enough individually to slip past auditing. Together, they formed something else entirely. They formed a story. A story about a doctor who'd learned that fraud, like medicine, was most effective when applied in small, careful doses. Her phone buzzed. David texting about dinner this weekend, asking if she could do Friday night. She stared at the message for a long time. Didn't answer. How could she explain to her son that she was sitting at her kitchen table looking at evidence of institutional corruption and wondering if she had the right to use it? Friday morning, Sterling made his move. He submitted an employment verification request to the rural clinic in Montana where Katie had worked under her maiden name, Bennett. The clinic administrator, Mrs. Holloway, called her that afternoon to confirm the request seemed legitimate. Sterling had asked pointed questions. Had Katie disclosed all prior employment? Any military service? Any disciplinary issues? Mrs. Holloway had been confused by the line of questioning but cooperative. She'd mentioned Katie was an excellent nurse, quiet, kept to herself. Katie's breath caught when Mrs. Holloway relayed the specifics of the call. By Wednesday, HR had scheduled an investigator to interview her. Friday at 1400, the same time as her initial counseling session about the chain of command violation. The walls were tightening. She sat in her car during her break on Wednesday, boots resting on the passenger seat next to her, the worn combat boots she'd kept hidden in her locker, the one she'd told people belonged to her brother. They felt heavier than they should have. She thought about driving to I-25 and just following it north. Montana. Washington. Canada. Somewhere she could disappear the way she'd been trying to disappear since Marjah. She didn't drive. Instead, she went back inside and printed the medication logs again. She locked them in a safe deposit box at her bank. She documented everything she'd observed. Equipment orders. Billing codes. Dates. Times. Amounts. By Thursday night, she had 43 pages of evidence that Dr. Richard Sterling was systematically defrauding Sacred Heart Hospital and probably every insurance company that had ever paid his bills. She also had the very clear knowledge that she was a nurse with no official authority, that Sterling had institutional power flowing from sources she couldn't identify, and that the moment she spoke up, he would activate those sources against her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came on Thursday evening when she was reviewing Commander Chen's chart and found a new note in Sterling's handwriting. A consultation note. For a patient he'd never examined. For a procedure the patient didn't need. The order was dated that morning. Chen's ventilator settings were being changed at Sterling's order. The sedation was being adjusted. The pain medications she'd carefully documented and verified were now being logged at different times than they were actually administered. Sterling was preparing to move Chen. Not because he needed different care. Because the ICU bed was valuable real estate, and Sterling had a lucrative elective surgery waiting for it. Katie stood in the medication dispensary, holding the printout of Chen's updated orders, and understood with perfect clarity what was about to happen. The needle decompression she'd trained on 8 years ago in the mountains above Kandahar. The hands that had held bleeding pressure wounds. The muscle memory that never really went away, it just waited, patient as a sniper in a hide, for the moment when it would be needed again. That moment was coming. She folded the papers and put them back in her pocket. Her voice, when she spoke to the evening shift nurse, was steady and contained. "I'll finish the 1,600 rounds if you want to take your break." "Sure," the nurse said, completely unaware that the quiet woman with the steady hands had already made a decision that would change everything. The phone rang at 3 in the morning. Sterling's office was dark except for the glow of his laptop screen, where he'd been scrolling through references for the past hour. He had Katie Morrison's social security number, obtained through the hospital's background check vendor with a simple request framed as routine verification, and now he had her maiden name. Bennett. She'd worked at a rural clinic in Montana for 6 years under that name, just after her discharge from active duty. Convenient. He'd already prepared the story. He was calling to verify employment dates for an internal promotion review. Nothing suspicious. Just thoroughness. The clinic director's voice was groggy at first, then cautious. Sterling's tone was professional, measured. He asked about Katie's punctuality, her reliability, her interpersonal skills. The director, an older man, rural Montana accent thick, spoke in Katie's favor. Good nurse. Quiet. Thorough. Never late. But something in Sterling's follow-up questions shifted the conversation. He asked if there had been any complaints. Any concerns. Any moments where she'd overstepped her scope of practice. The director hesitated. Just long enough. There was something, he finally said. Nothing major. But Katie had questioned a physician's order once. Respectfully, but she'd questioned it. A drug interaction concern, if he remembered right. The doctor had been irritated, but ultimately she'd been right about the interaction. Still, questioning authority had apparently stuck with the director. Sterling smiled. That was enough. By noon Thursday, he'd had an investigator assigned. The man was good, connected to several Denver security firms and completely unaffiliated with Sacred Heart's HR department, which meant Katie would never know he was digging. The investigator's job was simple: build a narrative. Pattern of insubordination. Questions about judgment. Maybe some whispers about her temperament, her ability to work with a team, her tendency toward independence that bordered on dangerous. Nothing provable. Nothing actionable on its own. But woven together, threaded through a personnel file alongside Sterling's own documented concerns, it would tell a story. A story that would stand up when he decided to use it. Katie was unaware of any of this as she pushed the medication cart down the ICU corridor at 0700 hours. Her hands moved through their practice sequence, checking each for site, scanning barcodes, documenting doses in the electronic chart, while her mind tracked the bigger picture the way it always did. Ventilator settings. Urine output trends. Pain scores. Commander Chen was holding stable, his post-op labs trending in the right direction. His oxygen saturation was solid at 96%. The chest tube was patent, draining clear serous fluid. He should be spending another 2 days in the ICU, minimum, before transfer to the step-down unit. Protocol was clear. Clinical judgment was clear. Sterling appeared at the unit desk around 10:30, moving with a kind of purposeful energy that made residents scatter. He pulled up the bed census on the monitor. The ICU was full, 14 beds occupied, and there was a waiting list. An elective cardioversion case was backed up, delayed because of the bed availability. The patient was a hospital board member's brother-in-law, referred to Sterling specifically. Lucrative. The kind of case that made donors feel seen. Katie was checking Commander Chen's dressing when Sterling appeared in the doorway. Prep Chen for radiology, Sterling said. Not a request. A command delivered as though it were routine. Katie looked up. Radiology for what? Chest X-ray. Post-op confirmation. She held his gaze for a single measured breath. Protocol didn't require an additional film. The post-op X-ray had been done in recovery. His baseline is documented. He's only been post-op for 36 hours. I want another look. His O2 saturation is solid. His breath sounds are bilateral and clear. Sterling's jaw tightened. She could see him calculating, deciding whether to engage. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of false patience doctors reserved for subordinates who were wasting their time. When you finish medical school, Morrison, you can make those decisions. Transport him now. 2 residents were watching from the hallway. A nursing assistant stood at the supply cart, pretending not to listen. Katie felt the weight of witnesses the way she always did, a tactical awareness of positioning and sight lines, a habit from places where witnesses could mean rescue or execution depending on who was watching. She didn't argue. She didn't repeat her concern. She simply nodded, moved to the bedside, and began documenting her objection in the chart's nursing note. 0930 hours, RN expressed concern regarding necessity of repeat imaging given clinical stability and recent post-op baseline. Physician override documented. Patient transported per physician order. The transport team arrived 10 minutes later. Katie assisted with the transfer from bed to stretcher with a kind of efficiency that came from 1,000 previous transfers. But as they were securing the rails, she reached out and checked the chest tube connection once more. It felt loose. Not obviously. Nothing someone without her level of attention would catch. But loose enough that the integrity of the system was compromised. The tube, she said quietly to the transport tech. It needs a fresh connector. It's fine, the tech said. Young. Maybe 2 years into the job. He just came from OR. Just change it, Katie said. It wasn't a request. There was something in her voice, something that made the tech's hands move before his mind caught up. He swapped out the connector, tested the new seal, secured it with fresh tape. Katie watched, nodded, stepped back. The doors of the ICU swung closed behind the stretcher and the transport team. Katie returned to her other patients, her hands moving through vitals and assessments and documentation with a kind of autopilot that freed her mind to work on larger problems. Sterling was moving Chen for financial reasons, not medical ones. That was clear. But moving a chest tube patient against clinical judgment? That bordered on reckless. She needed to anticipate what might happen. Needed to think in scenarios. 20 minutes later, her radio crackled. ICU to all staff, need a respiratory therapist stat to radiology. Patient's O2 sat dropping. Katie's head came up. Around her, the unit continued its rhythm. Beeps and alarms and the endless hiss of ventilators. But her nervous system, trained in threat assessment, was suddenly running at wartime cadence. She pulled up the electronic chart on the nearest computer and scrolled to Commander Chen's vitals, transmitted real-time from the monitors. Oxygen saturation, 84% and falling. Blood pressure, 118/71. Heart rate, 127, trending up. The transport team had taken him down the elevator at approximately 1015. The call came at 10:35. 20 minutes from departure to crisis. Her hands knew what that meant before her mind fully articulated it. Kinked chest tube. The connector she'd changed might have bought Chen 30 seconds, maybe 40. But if the tube had been compromised before transport, if movement and position changes had aggravated the kink, the fresh connection wouldn't save him. The problem wasn't the connector. The problem was the line itself. The problem was that he shouldn't have been moved. She was moving before anyone told her to move. Not running, that would have drawn attention, would have seemed panicked. She moved at a controlled pace, her body language neutral, her trajectory toward the elevators smooth and direct. Her mind was already in radiology, already running through the scenario, already knowing what she would find. The elevator smelled like something sharp, disinfectant mixed with something metallic. Ozone from earlier defibrillator use somewhere in the hospital. The doors opened on the basement level and she heard the chaos before she saw it. Voices elevated, someone calling for a doctor, alarms cutting through the steady background hum of hospital systems. Commander Chen's SATs were 78% when Katie arrived. The radiology tech was standing frozen beside the table. The nurse who'd accompanied transport was on the phone, trying to explain the crisis to someone who wasn't in the room. Chen's face was ashen. His breathing was labored, each inhale working against lung tissue that was collapsing. Tension pneumothorax. The air had escaped from the kinked tube into the pleural space, collapsing his left lung like a punctured balloon, creating pressure that was pushing his mediastinum toward his right side, compromising his cardiac output. Katie's vision tunneled the way it had in Marjah, the way it always did when the world narrowed to a single imperative. She moved to the crash cart, pulled open the drawer with the emergency equipment. 14-gauge needle. She didn't think about the radiology tech or the frozen nurse or the fact that she was a nurse practitioner operating in a zone that belonged to physicians. She thought about the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She thought about Sergeant Kowalski bleeding out in the marketplace, about the needle she'd pushed through his ribs, about the hiss of air and the color returning to his face. She thought about hands that remembered. She positioned Chen on his back, located the anatomical landmark, the space between the second and third ribs, the midclavicular line on his left side, and inserted the needle in one fluid motion. The angle was precise. The depth was perfect. Her hands didn't shake. The hiss of escaping air was immediate and unmistakable. The sound of pressure releasing, of lungs re-expanding, of a body learning how to breathe again. She watched Chen's oxygen saturation begin to climb. 82, 86, 90, 95. His heart rate dropped. His color returned. His breathing became less labored. "Get him to CT," Katie said quietly. It wasn't a question. "And get a thoracic surgeon down here. He needs re-evaluation for the tube placement." The radiology nurse was staring at her. "Where did you learn how to do that?" Katie didn't answer. She was already moving back, creating space, letting the physician authority return to the room when it finally arrived. Dr. Morrison from cardiothoracic was coming down the elevator. The resident was calling it in. The machinery of institutional response was activating now that the immediate crisis was resolved. Sterling arrived 90 seconds later. She could hear his footsteps before she could see him, fast, purposeful, then slowing as he took in the scene. Chen was stable. Katie was standing at the edge of the stretcher, her hands visible and empty, her posture neutral. The needle was in a sterile dish. The SATs were holding at 94%. Everything was under control. Sterling was still on his phone. She could see his mouth moving, could see his face cycling through calculations. He ended the call mid-sentence. His eyes found hers. In that moment, something shifted in his expression. Not fear. Not yet. But the beginning of the calculation that fear would grow from. He'd seen what she could do. He'd seen her move with absolute certainty into a crisis that would have paralyzed him. He'd seen her save a man's life in a way that made her expertise impossible to deny. "Morrison," he said, his voice controlled but the words carrying an edge they hadn't carried before. "My office. Now." Katie turned away from Commander Chen, acknowledged the other medical staff with a nod, and walked toward the elevator with Sterling. As the doors closed, she could hear the radiology nurse asking someone, "Did that really just happen? Did that nurse really just decompress a pneumothorax?" But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sterling had seen everything. Had documented, mentally, every moment of her competence. Had watched her hands move with military precision. Had watched her make decisions in a crisis with absolute authority. And now he knew he was running out of time. Sterling's office door closes with the soft precision of a coffin lid. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. His desk holds the fabricated complaint, already signed by a nursing supervisor he'd cultivated 3 weeks ago, a woman with a daughter in private school, a woman who understood that job security required flexibility. Katie Morrison had accessed Commander Chen's records without documented clinical necessity. Katie Morrison had lingered at his bedside beyond the scope of standard post-operative monitoring. Katie Morrison represented a liability, a boundary violation, a pattern of insubordination that had now crossed into HIPAA violation territory. "You're a liability, Morrison," Sterling says, his voice smooth as expensive leather. "Your pattern of insubordination. Your unauthorized procedures. Your boundary violations." Katie takes one measured breath. Her hands don't move from her sides. When she speaks, her voice drops into a register Sterling has never heard before, calm, precise, lethal as a scalpel. "You should be more careful about what you put in writing, Doctor." Sterling's eyes narrow. "Is that a threat?" She says nothing. The silence stretches like rubber, elastic and impossible. A siren wails in the distance outside the hospital, getting closer, then fading away toward another emergency that isn't theirs. Security arrives 90 seconds later. 2 men in dark polo shirts with badges clipped to their belts. The same guard who'd nodded to Katie every morning for 23 months won't meet her eyes as they walk her to her locker. 5 minutes. That's what is written on the termination form. 5 minutes to collect her personal belongings. The locker door swings open. Inside, a stethoscope she's owned for 8 years, its diaphragm worn smooth from 1,000 patients' chests. 3 family photos, David in his Navy dress uniform, David's daughter Quinn on her first day of kindergarten, a photo of Katie's ex-husband taken before the nightmares got too loud for their marriage to survive. A small succulent with pale green leaves, the one David brought her for her birthday 2 months ago, now drought-stressed and drooping. And at the very bottom, the worn combat boots. The boots her brother wore in Kandahar. The boots that have become her, that hold her secrets in their creases and scars. One of the security guards opens the cardboard box. The kind they use for discharged patients' belongings. The kind that sits beside hospital beds when families come to take people home for the last time. Katie places the items inside. Carefully. Deliberately. The stethoscope first, coiled like a snake that's finally tired. Then the photographs, edges down so the faces can't see what's happening. The succulent gets wrapped in a paper towel, it's already dying, but she wraps it anyway, because some things deserve dignity even on their way out. Last are the boots. They go in at an angle, one sole against the cardboard wall, the other resting on top of everything else. From the hallway, they look almost peaceful. "I need to get something from my car," Katie says. Her voice is still calm. Still measured. "I'll walk you down," the security guard says. He's older, maybe 60, with the careful movements of a man who's been in hospital security for 20 years and knows that kindness sometimes means silence. The walk from the 4th floor to the parking garage takes 8 minutes. They don't speak. The elevator smells like antiseptic and someone's perfume, something floral that Katie will never smell again without thinking of this moment. The parking garage echoes with their footsteps. The cardboard box is light. Everything in a person's professional life is always lighter than it should be. Katie's car is a 2015 Honda Civic. Reliable. Forgettable. Exactly what someone would choose if they were trying not to be noticed. She sets the box on the passenger seat. The combat boots are visible through the open top, their laces trailing like they're gasping for breath. "I hope things work out for you," the security guard says. He means it. She can hear it in the way his voice softens, the way his eyes finally meet hers for just a second before looking away. She drives home at 1 p.m. on a Tuesday. The house is the kind that exists in every American suburb, a ranch style with blue shutters, a driveway that needs sealing, a mailbox that says Morrison in faded gold letters. Katie pulls into the driveway and sits in the car for 11 minutes before turning off the engine. Her hands rest on the steering wheel. They don't shake. They won't shake. Pain is information, and right now the information is that she has failed at the only thing that mattered, the disappearing. She'd walked away from special forces to stop being a weapon. She'd chosen nursing because the work was intimate and real and invisible, the kind of work that heals without drawing attention. She'd been so careful. And it wasn't enough. Dr. Richard Sterling had seen through her composure like she was glass. He'd seen the sharpness in her eyes, the precision in her movements, and instead of her becoming normal, she'd become a threat that needed to be neutralized. The kitchen table is where she sits when she can't sit anywhere else. It's oak, solid, the kind of furniture that was made to last through family dinners and homework sessions and the quiet moments when a parent realizes their child has become a person they don't fully know. Katie places her palms flat against its surface. The tears come then, not quiet, not dignified, but real and ugly, and 20 years of trying to disappear all at once. She's still there when the front door opens at 2:17 p.m. David Morrison walks in wearing civvies, jeans and a navy hoodie, his SWAT supervisor's jacket slung over his arm. He's home early from a training exercise, surprised to find his mother at the kitchen table instead of the ICU, surprised to find her with her face in her hands like she's trying to hold her skull together. Mom. His voice shifts from curious to concerned in a single word. Why aren't you at work? Katie lifts her head. She looks at her son, 34 years old, a lieutenant commander in the Navy, a SWAT team leader, a man who commands respect the way other people command cars. She looks at him and cannot find words. He sits across from her without being invited. That's how he was trained. That's how special warfare teaches you to move through crisis, slow, deliberate, taking up space with authority but not aggression. He waits. Officers understand the power of silence better than civilians ever will. I just wanted to be normal, Katie whispers. The words crack as they leave her mouth, and it occurs to her that she's been saying this sentence in her head for 14 years, and now it's finally escaped into the air where it can't be taken back. David's jaw tightens. What happened? She can't answer. She tries, but her throat closes, and instead she just shakes her head, and her son, who has seen combat and trained under the 160th SAW Night Stalkers and qualified for SEAL Team 3 before taking the SWAT leadership track, reaches across the table and takes his mother's hand. He doesn't understand yet. But that night, when the phone call comes, when Bashir al-Hashimi decides that grief requires action, when a 6'5" man with a legal handgun walks into Sacred Heart Hospital's ICU looking for the doctor who let his mother die, everything will change. The kitchen goes quiet. Outside, rain begins to fall, the kind of afternoon rain that Denver gets in late spring, soft and persistent, the kind that sounds like forgiveness that doesn't quite arrive in time. The rain hammered against the kitchen window like applause that wouldn't stop. Katie sat motionless at the table, the cardboard box resting on the chair beside her like a monument to failure. Her son David found her there at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, still in her scrubs, rain-damp and hollow. He didn't ask what happened. He could read the answer in her silence. She'd chosen nursing to disappear. To heal in the quiet routines of vital signs and medication passes. To become someone small enough that the nightmares of Marjah couldn't find her. But Sterling had dismantled that sanctuary in 6 hours, and now she sat in the kitchen of the modest apartment she'd rented under her maiden name, listening to the rain and understanding that there was nowhere left to hide. The phone call came at 2:19 a.m. the next morning. David was asleep on the couch. He'd stayed, unwilling to leave his mother alone. Katie heard the first shot from blocks away, the distinctive crack of a 9mm round punching through drywall. Then more. Sirens. A dispatcher's voice crackling across every frequency in the city. An armed male, code 30 in progress, Sacred Heart Hospital, ICU floor. Her hands moved before her mind caught up. She dressed in 3 minutes. Black jeans, grey hoodie, nothing identifying. David woke to her grabbing her keys. He read the situation the way soldiers do, the tense jaw, the precise movements, the look that existed nowhere in civilian life. Mom, no. You have a command to lead, Katie said. Let me do mine. She was in her car before he could reach the door. The parking lot at Sacred Heart burned with emergency lights, red and blue painting the dawn like a fever. Police had established a perimeter 300 yards out. A SWAT team leader stood behind an armored vehicle, tactical radio crackling with unit call signs and coordinates. Somewhere inside the building, a gunman was terrorizing the ICU, and everyone with the authority to stop him was staging an entry protocol that would take at least 15 minutes to execute. Katie slipped past the police barricade using a nurse's invisibility. No one really sees hospital staff, especially at moments of chaos. The security guard at the service entrance was focused on the main entrance where tactical teams were assembling. She moved through the corridors like water finding a crack in stone, her breath steady, her footfall silent despite her boots. Muscle memory took over. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The ICU doors were locked. Inside, she could hear him screaming in Pashto. Her blood went cold. The doctor who let my mother die. Sterling! Sterling, come out! A massive figure moved past the glass partition, 6'5", 280 pounds, wild-eyed and waving a pistol like he was conducting an orchestra of chaos. Medical staff huddled in supply rooms. Nurses crouched behind the nurses' station. One resident was trying to compress himself into an empty cabinet. They were following protocol, shelter in place, wait for tactical response. Bashir al-Hashimi didn't know protocol. He knew only that his mother had died during an unnecessary surgery. He knew only that the doctor had prioritized profit over her life. He knew only that sometimes the only response to theft is destruction. Katie used her badge to unlock the doors. The hiss of the electronic mechanism seemed impossibly loud. She stepped into the ICU with her hands visible and her voice steady, the same voice that had talked down an insurgent holding a dead man's switch in a Marjah marketplace. Bashir. The gunman's head snapped toward her. For a moment, nothing moved. The fluorescent lights hummed their standard pitch. A ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm from room 347. The gun lowered an inch. His eyes went wide. Recognition flashed across his face like lightning. When he spoke, his voice cracked, the angel of Marjah. The one who pulled my brother from the fire. Katie took another step forward. I remember. His name was Hasim. He had a scar on his left shoulder. You were 14. You cried. Tears began streaming down Bashir's face. The gun fell to his side. My mother. They killed her. The doctor, he... I know, Katie said. I know what he did. The FBI knows. Everyone will know. But this isn't how justice works, Bashir. Put the gun down. Please. The weapon clattered to the tile floor. He was on his knees when David arrived with the SWAT team, tactical gear and command authority and the particular gravity that comes from leading men into darkness. His eyes found his mother, and for exactly 1 second, his professional composure cracked. Then he stepped into the ICU and spoke with a voice that carried across the frozen space like a command to every person who'd ever doubted her, stand down for Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison. The room went absolutely silent. Someone behind the nurse's station made a small sound, half gasp, half sob. A SEAL team leader who'd flown in to visit Commander Chen stepped forward. He was carrying a file folder that looked older than memory. His voice was steady. Senior Chief Morrison served 12 years, 2009 to 2021. 3 tours in Kandahar province. This citation is for Valor under fire in Marjah, April 2015. 14 civilians. Hostile territory. Direct fire. She was 23 years old. He paused. The file moved to the next document. His voice didn't waver. Bronze Star with Combat V. Katie's eyes remained fixed on Bashir. He was understanding now. Understanding who had held him in the rubble of his childhood. Understanding the silence she'd carried. Second Bronze Star with Combat V. The SEAL continued. Bagram Airfield, March 2016. The hospital CEO had stepped into the ICU now, standing beside a federal agent in a dark suit. The agent was speaking into her phone. Dr. Richard Sterling is under federal arrest for healthcare fraud, kickback schemes, and obstruction of a federal investigation. Commander Chen wore a wire per hour 6-month investigation. The hospital is a crime scene pending evidence collection. She turned to Katie. Your inadvertent assistance in documenting the medication discrepancies and your dismissal as retaliation were extremely helpful, Senior Chief. Thank you. The SEAL team leader's voice rose slightly, and when he spoke, every person in the ICU heard him. Silver Star, Marjah Province, April 2015. For exceptional valor in saving 14 civilians while under sustained enemy fire. The citation reads, without regard for personal safety, Senior Chief Morrison moved through hostile terrain under constant fire, physically carrying wounded civilians to safety. Her actions directly prevented mass casualties and resulted in the rescue of an entire family compound. Katie closed her eyes. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds. Then applause, the nurses emerging from their hiding places, the residents stepping out of supply cabinets, the security team who'd been waiting in the hallways, all standing witnesses to recognition that should have come years ago but arrived today, here, now, in the form of medals, and witness and her son's pride finally visible on his face. Sterling was being escorted from the ICU by hospital security. The same guard who'd handed her the cardboard box yesterday approached with an identical box in his hands. He was walking Sterling toward the elevators with barely concealed satisfaction. I believe you know the way out, sir, the guard said, and the words carried the weight of 2,000 years of poetic justice. Sterling's hand shook taking the box. His medical license was suspended pending investigation. His name was being stripped from every wall in the hospital, including the donor plaque near the ICU that bore his name and the date of his $5 million generosity. That generosity had been purchased with stolen kickbacks from a supply company that was now being dismantled by federal agents. Katie stood in Commander Chen's room while Bashir was being processed. No charges filed, the federal agents understood motivations born from grief. Crisis counseling arranged. His mother's surgical records being reviewed for malpractice. Chen was awake and lucid, his chest tube properly secured, his breathing steady. He gripped Katie's hand with the strength of a man who'd been saved by someone extraordinary. David never told me his mother was special warfare, Chen said quietly. He told me you were a nurse in Montana. Katie's voice carried the texture of gravel. I am a nurse. I just needed to stop being the other thing. Chen nodded, understanding the way combat veterans understand, that sometimes you survive only by fragmenting yourself, and integration is a fight harder than any battlefield. David entered moments later, still in tactical gear, and sat beside his mother without speaking. The three of them, the SEAL commander, the SEAL officer, and the senior chief who'd wanted to disappear, sat together in a room where the machines beat their steady rhythm and nobody felt the need to fill the silence with words. 2 months later, David sent his mother a photograph. Dr. Richard Sterling stood in a community college gymnasium, teaching CPR to board students, $18 an hour on his paycheck stub. His medical license revoked. His board memberships terminated. His network collapsed. He was under house arrest pending trial for wire fraud, healthcare fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The board member who'd enabled him had resigned in disgrace. The supply company CEO who'd split kickbacks with him was facing federal charges. Everything Sterling had built was ash. In the photograph's background, barely visible but perfectly clear, Katie Morrison stood in dress blues at the Denver Veterans Memorial Ceremony. Her worn combat boots, the ones she'd hidden for 3 years, the ones that had carried her through Marjah and forward, were now cleaned and preserved in a glass case on Sacred Heart's Wall of Honor. The plaque beneath read, Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, USN, Ret. Angel of Marjah, exemplary service to Sacred Heart Hospital. David stood beside her in his service uniform, SEAL trident visible on his chest. Commander Robert Chen stood in the front row, recovered, saluting her. Bashir al-Hashimi attended with his family, his mother's death ruled medical malpractice, a settlement pending that would fund a patient advocacy foundation in her name. Katie received a standing ovation from 200 veterans and hospital staff, including the nurses who'd avoided her in the break room, now visibly ashamed, now understanding that they'd been standing next to a legend. At the reception afterward, the new ICU director, a former Navy nurse who'd served with Katie in Afghanistan, offered her senior nurse position with a raise and full autonomy over the ICU standards. Katie touched the glass case holding her boots, felt the weight of 3 years of running, and understood finally that she no longer needed to choose between who she'd been and who she'd become. "I need them to stay here," she said quietly. "I need to remember I don't have to choose between the soldier and the nurse. They're the same person." She accepted the position. That night, David asked what she'd learned through everything. Katie looked at her son, really looked at him, and finally understood what she'd been running from all along, not the memories, but the shame of them. Not the violence, but the silence that had made it invisible. "True class is what you do when the lights go out," she said. "I spent 3 years hiding in the dark. It took walking toward danger one more time to remember that's where I do my best work." She returned to Sacred Heart Monday morning, not as someone hiding from her past, but as someone integrating all of it. The boots watched from their glass case as she began her shift, and for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't running anymore. If you found yourself moved by Katie's story, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. And here's my question for you: have you ever been underestimated by someone in a position of power who didn't know your true value? Drop a comment below, I'd love to hear your story.